All right, so you're on lesson 21, which is page 48. And we have a lot of people out of town for the month. The Raws are, I think, halfway. They're in LA right now waiting on their next plane, is my understanding. Of course, the Deans are in the Gulf, and the Dabs are in the Gulf, and so got a lot of people out. School's out and vacation time has started. If you have your Bible, turn to Nehemiah. Turn to Nehemiah. That's it's going to be where we're at, really, for all of tonight, is Nehemiah. Nehemiah 2 in verse 17 is printed at the top of your page on page 48. And I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we no longer be a reproach. Obviously, Nehemiah shows up several years after Ezra, the book of Ezra's recording, or at least the progress stops. And he shows up to build the wall. And this is the verse where he introduces the real reason he's there. Up until this point, by the way, I'm not sure there's really a good understanding what this guy's doing here. And this is when he finally comes out and says, this is what's going on. And the question was, what does Nehemiah do in the first part of this verse that will get buy-in? What does he do? In there. Raise your hand. We got mic runners, and Jonathan right here in the middle, and John Clemens, and I could almost just move the reeds over and we'd just be on one side tonight. Just got a little. What does he do that will get buy-in there in this verse 17? What do you see there that gets buy-in? Daryl?
He brings to their attention the condition of the city.
Okay. All right, anybody else?
I'll add to that. He makes it about everyone. He said,
Okay.
We are in trouble. You know it, I know it. We have to
Okay.
address this together.
All right. Anybody else?
Well, at the end, he says, so that we'll no longer suffer derision.
Okay. I think it's an interesting question because I think all those things are good answers. I think maybe it's simpler than that. And I think maybe it's just as simple as that Nehemiah said to them. And a lot of those other things are great, but the idea here, I think, that at least to me is the point is that Nehemiah has communication with the people. And that's what's going to get the buy-in. Now, the other things are part of that, but the real part of the buy-in, and I think that's what he's getting at based on some things he talks about next, is kind of an openness to a degree in this communication. And we're going to talk about this because I think if we're not careful, we can think Nehemiah is doing things he's not doing necessarily, but he is here bringing this to the people. Now, what he says to them is important, and I think how he says it is important because he doesn't come in and just say, all right, here's the answer. I'm going to fix everything. And the inclusion of everybody starts with the communication to begin with. I could tell you that... So in, I guess roughly 24 years preaching, give or take a couple of months, and roughly 10 years of that with elders, which means that communication was non-existent to a degree, and yet in one way, communication when you don't have elders is not there, and in another way, that's all there is. There's not a lot of other things. But in the years of working with elders, I can tell you that the biggest issue that every congregation I've had in regards to leadership starts really with this idea of communication. And there's different ways that could be facilitated in ways that we can talk about that, but that's a huge issue. I think, what do you think perhaps complicates that for us today especially? Is there anything about us, specifically our culture, that makes the need for communication so important? You ever thought about that? we are raised to be involved in somewhat of a democracy where we believe in the power of everybody and the right of everybody to make a decision. And because of that sometimes, and by the way, is the church set up that way? Not really. In fact, I think one of the things to keep in mind is the church is really set up like Israel, as a theocracy, that God is the head of the church, or Christ in this sense is the head of the church. And it's the elders' job to serve that. But it's not necessarily done by voting or by everybody in agreement. But I think especially in our culture, it's important to have buy-in because of that precedent of everybody having a voice, so to speak. Because when the people feel like they're being neglected, it generally is a very bad thing. Leads to a lot of complaints and so forth. That also, along with, at least when I was in school, now that's a long time ago, and when I was in the business world for just a brief moment, it was retail, but there was a big push for empowerment to lower level people. And I'll give you an example at Target. When I was at Target, and I think there's still this, I don't know, maybe not, but when I was there, and that's a long time ago, if you came and said something was less than 20% different than what it rang up, or less than $20, we didn't have to have manager's approval. We could change it just automatically. And so that same thing of you get to control part of what you're doing, that's ingrained in our personality. And all of that, I think, creeps its way into the church somewhat. Hopefully you've read this, but there's this discussion of, or an example, it's really a case study, is really what this is, about a church where the leadership decided they're going to build a new church building. But the way they say that is they get up on a Sunday morning and say, we've decided we're building a church building on the other side of town. And how do you think that went over, by the way? Probably not very good. What's the problem with that? Why does that cause such a problem? Why is that an issue? We're so talkative tonight. Missing Brandon and Scott's teaching class, so Jonathan and Daryl, then Jonathan.
Because of a lack of transparency,
Okay.
the people were kept in the dark and were just blindsided by it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say it's a major disruption to the status quo. And there was no heads up, no explanation of why. It was just rolled out.
Right. And it's kind of, if you're familiar with sunshine laws in most states, that kind of requires our government officials to have public discussions about such things. And the contrast of that is what he alludes to here, this discussion happened in the dark, so to say, behind closed doors. And so, again, communication is a big part of this buy-in. What could the elders have done differently to get buy-in? What could they have done differently? Or maybe this is the question. If they're going to pattern themselves after Nehemiah, what would they have said? Because I think that's really what he's getting at here. Anybody have any ideas what that would have looked like? How about something like, hey, we've discussed, and our building just doesn't meet our needs right now. Now, that, by the way, that could be a bunch of different things. I mean, it could be that the neighborhood is left the kind of community that you want to be in. It could be that the building doesn't meet your needs for seating. It could be a lot of things. But for whatever reason, the comment being, hey, look, our building is not meeting its needs, and we need to solve that. And if we're going to fix that, it's going to take all of us working together, but this is what we think we need to do, but we'd love to hear from you. Now, honestly, the elders are basically saying the same thing. Hey, we've met and discussed about this, and we've decided we probably need to be on the other side of town. But they did it in a way that creates communication and buy-in rather than just this, here's what we're doing. So, yeah.
Terry, the situation that, don't know if this is working, the situation that Nehemiah found himself in is that the people in Jerusalem had these problems, but
Right.
nobody knew what to do about it. I mean, all they had to do was just look around and they could see it. I mean, that's part of what Nehemiah says. He just says, look around. We know we're in trouble.
Right.
And we've got to do something about it. So there was probably a leadership vacuum there, and nobody had stepped up. So Nehemiah stepped into there, says, here's what's going on. Here's what we need to do. Gets everybody involved immediately.
Yeah.
They knew what was going on.
Yeah, I think there's a host of problems going on in the returned people. I mean, they know what to do, but quite frankly, nobody's leading that. But there's also a lot of fear involved in that, and there's a lack of research. Nehemiah solves a lot of issues before he ever gets there. We're going to see that in a little bit. But even the security issue, even the idea of if we build this wall, how are the people outside this city going to respond and react? And the fear that all of that is part of what sets the stage for Nehemiah when he comes. And so there's a huge part of that where they go, yeah, we can see this as a problem. But it does take a leader to organize and to point them in the right direction. And what we're talking about is just getting people really, and for a large degree, just to follow. That's a big part of that. What was Nehemiah's approach? He had a three-pronged approach here. What three things? I came up with four just to be contrarian. But what was his approach? You can do three or you can do four. Anybody have some things to point out that he did? Okay, Terry, if we can get a mic to Terry Reed there.
Well, he pointed out the problem first,
Yeah.
but then he said, let us do it. He's not telling them to do it. He said, let us do it. He won't, I'm here to help and contribute. But the fact that he included himself in that, I think, goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Two great points. Anything else from there?
I think he not only identified the problem, he provided a solution, and
Okay.
he provided an outlook of what the ultimate outcome would be from that solution.
Okay, good thoughts. All good thoughts. I think first, let me give you, Daryl, go ahead. And then Joe, do you want to? Maybe not.
The second one I had, that he showed a concern because he said it was a reproach to the Jewish people, and it was a lack of safety because of the walls being down
Okay.
and no gates.
Yep. Yeah, I think, by the way, one of the things that's important is to keep reading past verse 17, which is where I get part of my fourth. Maybe that's where Joe's going. But go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, just he cast the benefit, which is right now you're viewed this way, and we're God's people. We don't need to be viewed that way.
Yeah.
It sounds like pride the way he says it.
Right.
But really, when everything God had done along the way had pointed to excellence, and had pointed to beauty, and had pointed back to the garden, and how they, and it was orderly and well done. And he said, this is not who we are. Mm-hmm. And he cast the benefit of this will change how other nations view us, and they are a conquered people right now. So that's the benefit.
Sure. Good point. If you throw in verse 18, which I think is really important to get all of this, which verse 18 says, I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and the words the king had spoken to me, and they said, let us rise up and build. Four things. First, and a lot of this has been said, but he identifies the problem. But second, I think in addition to that, he really stresses the seriousness of the problem, which is getting partially to what Joe said, this issue of we're a reproach. Look how bad it is, and not just how unprotected we are, but what does it say about us as a people that it looks this way? Thirdly, he makes a commitment and asks them for a commitment to take action to address all of this. But then fourthly, by adding in verse 18, he shows them how God's hand has already been involved in this up to this point, and how even the king has provided everything they need up to this point. And I think that gets at part of what I was saying earlier. Part of the issue was fear. Part of the issue was no leadership. Part of the issue was resources. And there's a lot of things that went into the wall not being built back. And Nehemiah comes in and we're going to talk about what he does before this moment here in a minute, but he goes through and he gets the people to buy in, and part of that is saying all this has been taken care of. The wood, the craftsmen, that's been provided by the king. God sent me here, and we even have letters of protection. All the things that you read about in chapter 1 and 2 up to this point, he's informing them of in verse 18. Which I think plays a really powerful part in all of this. Did you notice anything he didn't do? Do you have your hand up, Peyton?
I didn't notice anything he didn't do. I did have a question I did notice about reading it. He says the phrase "my God" instead of "our God." What's the deal there? Are they not
just
the
a common
Israelites?
phrase? And no, I think it refers to "our," but he's speaking from a first-person singular perspective more than anything else. You'll see Paul do that at times. Not all that uncommon. Here's what he doesn't do. He didn't point out the problem and then ask the people to tell him how to fix it. And I don't know if that sticks out, but Nehemiah comes in, and we're going to see this. Nehemiah comes in as a leader, and he has a set direction this is going to go if the people will buy in. And that is where this is different, by the way, to kind of our thought process. When there's a big, massive project, we think everybody gets to vote sometimes. And that's not necessarily how that works. And I think, by the way, I think there is some wisdom. What Nehemiah does is he's already, as the leader, decided how to handle the issue. He's not asking the people how to tell him how to handle the issue. He's asking them to commit to being a part of that decision going forward. And that's a big difference and something that needs to be kind of distinctly seen. So let's he asked the question at the top, page 49, what would have happened if Nehemiah got into town and said, "I'm Nehemiah and I'm here to fix your problem"? What do you think would have happened there? I mean, first thought is what? Some guy comes in and he says, "I'm Nehemiah and I'm here to fix your problem." What's your first response going to be if you're one of those people in Jerusalem? Jonathan?
I'll just say I've actually heard somebody do that, seen it firsthand, and it did not go well.
Yeah. Why?
Nobody believed them. Nobody gave any credit. They were basically laughed off.
Yeah.
Well, nobody in Jerusalem probably even knew who Nehemiah was.
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, it's one of these deals of, well, who are you? Right? It's like the equivalent of some guy coming in at a high level and just cleaning house, and I'm going to fix this whatever branch, office, whatever it is. And of course that stuff happens. But when that happens, people aren't happy. And a lot of it has to do with, well, who are you? You've not been here for the last X number of years. You don't know what's going on. So that's your first response. Nobody's going to buy in with that. Daryl, Jonathan, you give Daryl the mic.
Yeah, the response could have been, who put you in charge anyway?
Yeah. Who said you could do this? Yeah. And we've talked about this a lot, but leadership by force is generally not a good tactic. If ultimatums in my way or the highway is how you do things, that's not real good. The difference in that approach and the approach with the case study with the building really is, in both of those, there's the missing of the explanation of why this is important. He goes into a lot of that in that paragraph section at the top of page 49. And when I was studying this and preparing for tonight, I just thought for a moment about the question why. And I don't know if you've thought about that much, but it's a question we all ask, but you don't realize how annoying that is until you have a 3-year-old. And what you really want sometimes is for the 3-year-old to stop asking why, right? And yet, we never grow out of that, personally. Because when we're asked to do something, what's usually the first thought in our head? Why? And generally speaking, when I was growing up, and even the way I raised my kids, sometimes the answer was just because I told you to. But we still ask those questions, and I think that's interesting. If there's not a why it's funny to ask it that way. If they don't explain the why, then why does that fail? How about that? Why does that fail? Why do you not get buy-in without explaining the why? Peyton?
Just me personally, I would want to know why. I'm not going to go into a situation without knowing what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's just it. I'm not going to buy in when I don't see any reason, when I don't have an understanding. So let's talk about Nehemiah. That's really the best part of this. We've done a lot of other stuff, but let's go back to Nehemiah 1, and let's just talk about how Nehemiah does what he does here, because really and truthfully, Nehemiah 1 and 2 is probably one of the best scriptural examples of leadership and thoughtful, strategic leadership in that sense. We're not going to read all of that, but in chapter 1, let's look at verses 1 through 4. Let's read that. Who has that and can read that for us? 1 through 4. Daryl said he'd read it.
The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven.
All right, so Nehemiah finds out, he's got people that come in bringing this report. He asks, by the way, and he finds out what is going on back in Jerusalem. By the way, do you think Nehemiah grew up in captivity or grew up in Jerusalem and was exiled? He grew up in captivity. Okay? So Nehemiah is asking about Jerusalem, which is a place he's never lived before. But he understands, and I think this is a credit to his parents, he understands historically what the city means to his people, to the descendants of Abraham.
He's fascinating because essentially he's a sommelier.
Yeah.
And he's the king's sommelier. And he's not a priest. He's not a prophet. He's not of the tribe of Judah. So he's not in the kingly lineage. But he knows God's word. When you roll forward and you see, he remembers the promises to Moses.
Yep.
And so many, we've seen the story of Israel, so many along the way have lost track of God's word.
Right.
I think Josiah when you think that thought. And here is a wine expert for the king of Babylon, and or actually Medo-Persian Empire.
Right. At this
And,
point, Medo-Persian.
And he's so spiritual. That's just it's an amazing story all the way around.
It is. And it's interesting that grows up in captivity, but one of the things he does, and Joe referenced this, is especially in his prayer, he references, much of his prayer is based on law, Torah passages, like especially Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 5, he references there. He's very similar to Moses a little bit. Moses intercedes like 5 times to finally get God to change his mind. But Nehemiah in this prayer, he kind of says to God, hey, remember, these are the promises. And these are the promises you've given. And let me go back and help you fulfill the promises, is basically what he's saying there. So here's a man born in captivity in a foreign, strange land, but raised to know the law. And by the way, not only Deuteronomy 30, but some of the prophets, you could see a strong tie to that. So you can see, for instance, a strong tie to Jeremiah, although it's not reasonable to think he heard Jeremiah, right? Because Jeremiah is a contemporary somewhat, but in Jerusalem. But I think there is an influence of Ezekiel in this, and I think we see an influence of others as well. And so you see this kind of connection and this tie-in. But when he hears about this, his heart is moved. And his response is to do what?
Well, Terry, that's kind of one thing I thought was real impressive, because most of us, me included, would be like, we see that situation, it's like, okay, great, we need to put together a plan and we need to go do this, this, and this.
Yeah.
He didn't do any of that. He immediately started fasting and praying.
Yeah. Yes. And what do we learn from that? What do you learn from that? Before you become God's project manager, you need to include God. Right? Because that's how we respond is, oh, well, here's what we'll do. Now, does that mean that Nehemiah didn't know what he wanted? No, I think we see in the prayer. Nehemiah has he knows what he needs and wants. But he knows he cannot do any of this without God. One of the things I think you've heard me say, especially over the past year and a half, is that the ancients always attributed everything good or bad to God. And we've kind of gotten away from that to a degree. But they saw that as everything that happened in their life, whether good or bad, God was at the root of it. And we've kind of left that idea. And you see reflected here, part of that is he knows if he's going to get to do what he thinks needs to be done, it will only be because God orchestrates it and makes it happen. And so he fasts and prays, and then this prayer, starting in verse 5, and I want you to notice, by the way, what he prays for, the different things. O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we've sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We've acted very corruptly against you, have not kept the commandments, the statutes, the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. So there's the reference, one of the references to the law. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. By the way, that's the blessings, curses, Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather and bring them to the place that I've chosen to make my name dwell there. And by the way, that is a reference to Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 5. They are your servants and your people whom you've redeemed by your great power, by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and to the prayer of your servant who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. And what does he mean at the end there?
Let the king buy in.
Yeah, because the next phrase is, I'm the cupbearer to the king. So what he's saying is, hey, I'm about to go in and I'm about to go do my job and give me a hearing with the king. And so he depends on God to make what we read in chapter 2 to happen. What's included in that prayer? What are some of the different things that are in that prayer?
Praise,
John?
praise, confession.
Praise and confession for sure. Yeah. Petition, right?
Vision.
Scripture. A reminder to God of what his promises are. Have you ever prayed so boldly to God that you remind God what he promised you? Because I got to tell you, I think for most of us, that's like next level prayer right there. For most of us, we're like, man, I'm not going to tell God what he should do. And by the way, we see Moses doing that. We see Nehemiah doing that. We see their prayers being answered. And so there's a lot of things. What I really find important there is the confession. Hey, look, we've sinned. And by the way, that confession follows with this promise of, now if we come back, you'll bring us back from every corner of the earth. And it's as if, by the way, what he's acknowledging there is, yeah, we deserve the curses you gave to us, but now, God, it's time to bring us back. It's time for you to do what you promised you would do. So be with me when I go into the king. Yep. Get the mic to Joe.
It's just, they deserve the blessings.
Yeah. It's kind of like this. We've served the time. Now we deserve the blessings.
Based on his
based on what you said, based on this being your promise. Which again reminds me of Moses, when God comes down in Exodus 32, here's this calf and all that blows up in Exodus 32, 33, 34. And then after that, God's just like, I'm done. And Moses is like, wait a minute, you promised that you would take these people and turn them into this nation. And then God kind of relents and says, okay, well, you'll get the land, but I'm not going to be around for much. And then Moses, and that's why you see kind of different stages till Moses finally gets God to relent. Which, by the way, the children of Israel were deserving of the punishment what God wanted to give them. It is God's grace that is seen there, but Moses is the one interceding. So, again, interesting stuff. So, in chapter 2, we're not going to read this, but in the first 5 verses, he goes in, and what happens when he goes in? He goes in, he gives the wine to the king, and the king what? He notices something is different today. What's different? Peyton?
He sees that Nehemiah's upset.
Yeah, he sees that Nehemiah's upset. So Nehemiah has been, pretty much it says that he's never been this way in front of the king. He's always been positive, upbeat, but he comes in and he's so upset that his face shows it. Now, do you think Nehemiah put on a show to get the king's attention? I really don't. And here's why. I believe based on what occurs in chapter 1, Nehemiah is that heartbroken about what's going on in Jerusalem. He has fasted, he has prayed, he has begged God to help him. What you see in chapter 1 is just the pure heart Nehemiah has for what is going on here. And when you long for something to be fixed by God, okay, that's the thing there, and you are anxious about what's going on in this way, this is going to have a change in your countenance, to use a biblical word. Joe?
Yeah, that's the strongest evidence, but the secondary evidence, which is pretty strong, is you don't punk a king.
Yeah.
You don't play the king.
Yeah.
Because it's not like being in a democracy where you just lose your job.
No, you can be killed.
You lose your head,
Yeah.
right? And so that
Absolutely.
would be the other reason why he would not
Absolutely.
do that.
Yeah. So he asks what's going on, and essentially Nehemiah tells him, and then Nehemiah asks him if he can go back. And what is interesting is that Nehemiah doesn't stop there, because Nehemiah doesn't just stop with permission to return and build the city walls. In fact, it's interesting how this starts. I don't know if you notice how this starts, but how it starts is the king thinking this is just kind of a vacation of sorts. Like, well, how long will you be gone? And Nehemiah basically says, not coming back, and here's what we need. we need stuff. We need resources. I need a safe passage. And that's where we see that it's interesting that Nehemiah knows that part of the problem with the wall is the fear. He's taking letters back from the king that guarantee protection from the empire to those people who've been outside of Jerusalem, threatening against the people inside of Jerusalem. And not only guaranteeing protection, but guaranteeing he can have resources, all that is needed. Okay? And the king gives him everything. And in chapter 2 and verse 8, there at the second part, and this is really important, the king granted for me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. And what you see there in verse 8 is that Nehemiah is going back to his prayer in chapter 1, essentially, and saying, God answered my prayer. God did exactly what I asked him to do with this interaction with the king. And so then Nehemiah comes, starting in verse 9, and Sanballat and Tobiah hear about this, and they are not happy that here comes Nehemiah. And I'm not sure they even know at this point what Nehemiah is planning on doing. But they see Nehemiah returning with men, with protection, and they know something is up. And they are not happy about that, okay? So then, what does Nehemiah do next? In verses 9 through 16, what does Nehemiah do? I feel like being from Ferris Bueller. Bueller.
He goes out and looks at the problem at night without anybody knowing where he went. Is that what you're speaking of?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Why does he do that? That seems like a weird thing to do.
Well, he wanted to get a first-hand look at what was really going on without tipping his hand and letting a lot of people know what he was thinking about. Because I think it says that he has yet to tell anybody what was in his heart to do.
Okay? So he goes out with a few guys and only one animal, which he rode upon, it says. And they go through around the wall. And they look at all these different spots of the wall. Now, without a doubt, part of this is, no doubt, Nehemiah figuring out how bad it is. And he's doing that in the secrecy of night for a couple of reasons, I think. One of those is to not let the Israelites know exactly what his plan is yet. It's not time for that. We might call this the research and development phase of what's going on here. You'll see later on, by the way, that I think part of this is, too, that Nehemiah is also developing a strategy. One of the things that Nehemiah does later in the book is he has you work on the wall closest to your house. He intentionally does that because, by the way, if you're building the wall that's in front of your house, you're going to make sure it's built right? Also convenience and those kind of things. So he's coming up with a plan, but who else is not able to see him and going around at night and looking at the wall?
The bad guys.
Sanballat and Tobiah are not seeing what's going on. So it's not just that he's keeping this from the good guys, to use John's terminology, but the bad guys aren't going to know what's going on at that time. Because if it's just a few guys kind of seeing different parts of the wall at night, and you don't keep track of that a couple nights in a row, not a big deal. But now, if in the daytime you see 40 guys walking the wall all day long and measuring and taking a look, then all of a sudden when you're the enemies, hey, something's up. Something's going on here. And so one of the things I think is important about that with this idea of leadership in part of this is to go back to Nehemiah already knew what the solution was. And he was doing the work necessary in order to provide that solution and get buy-in when the time came. I think this is where, to get back to our kind of need for the why and the kind of our democratic urges that we have, the right to have a voice, that we have to realize that there is a responsibility from the sheep standpoint to trust the shepherds in this process. And I mean that even when it's going on and you don't know what's going on, and sometimes people go, well, what are the elders doing about this? Well, you may not realize it, but they're doing a lot about that. They're just in this kind of R&D phase of the problem to figure out what the next step is. And then some people are like, well, after the solution is mentioned, well, how do they do that? Well, they did a lot of work behind the scenes. Like Nehemiah, they walked the wall at night. There's a lot of that happens, and part of that's just trust that we give to the shepherds in that phase. Both as it's going on and we don't know, and even after it's been revealed and we don't know. So he does all of that in seclusion. And then he comes to those two verses we read in 17 and 18. Where after all that process of praying and fasting and getting God's help and the king's help and coming in, he then says, now, how much work went into all of what was going to happen prior to the announcement? A whole lot of work. Yeah, Jonathan?
I was going to say, in addition to that, with the, the letters of passage and the resources that he provided or got from the king, he anticipated and had answers for the objections the people would have.
Yep.
So he knew what the pushback was going to be and already had answers to overcome that.
Right. Absolutely. Good point. So in verse 17, now when he comes out public, we've kind of talked about this. He asks for their cooperation, right? He asks for a commitment is what he asks for. And then to touch on what Jonathan says, to kind of convince them of any objections they may have, he points out two things to them in verse 18. We've already pointed this out. God's with us, and the king has provided all of this. So he points out to them, here are these two things that are going on. So what do they respond with in verse 18?
Well, they responded with, let us rise up and build,
Yeah.
which is not what the nation of Israel normally responds with. If you go back through all the history, every time something like this happens, they say, well, you know, there's giants in the land, they got big walls, we can't do this, we can't do that, you know, all this kind of stuff. Here, they said, okay, let us arise and build.
Yeah,
Kind of amazing.
I'll say to defend them slightly that, yeah, the giants is a bad one, and Goliath is a bad one. But there are times where they, like in Exodus 24, yeah, we'll agree to do this, and then 3 chapters later, they're building a calf. Joshua, you know, think about that with Joshua, that initially, hey, we'll follow you, Joshua, and it just takes a couple of days till there's already an issue with Achan. So there's a lot of times, too, that they say, hey, we're going to do this. And we'll see that here, that they agree to do this. If you were to keep reading the story of Nehemiah, does it take a little encouragement for Nehemiah to get them to continue the task? Yeah. Because they start it, and what happens? There's a little hiccup, and then they finish it pretty quickly. But yeah, they commit to get up and build. Why do you think they did that? What was it about Nehemiah, for instance, that you think caused them to do that? What do you think they saw in Nehemiah? Yeah, vision. Joe says vision. Yeah, vision. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how it's going to change your life. I've already got not only the vision for how to fix the wall and what it will do for us, but I had the vision to get the resources and the protection and everything that we need. And was this process easy, the building of the wall? No, because there's one moment where we see them literally holding a weapon in one hand and building with the other hand. So it was not going to be an easy job, and Sanballat and Tobiah are not going to stand by and just let this go on unchallenged. And Nehemiah knows that, and the people know that. But what Nehemiah says, I think, is important. God's hand is with us. And the king provided the resources and his protection, but what Nehemiah is pointing to there is, this is a work God wants us to do. God's already answered prayers and proven this, and God will see us through this. Trust in God, and let's get to work. And so they do. I also think they see his character in this, by the way. I think that's important, too, that they see the character of Nehemiah.
And Terry, you just got to love this attitude, though, where they come back and say, let us rise up and build.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just, and later we see verses like where the people had a mind to work.
Yep. And it's interesting in verse 19, even when Sanballat and Tobiah go, what are you doing? You're rebelling against the king. And I love Nehemiah's response. The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will rise and build, but you have no portion or right to claim in Jerusalem. So what you see there with Nehemiah, too, is he's pretty strong-willed and determined in what they're going to do. And he's not afraid, but he ties that even to what God's done. And I think that's one of the greatest things here is what God has done in this process. The big portion of this is really the idea of how the elders get buy-in. But I think there's that lesson for all of us is, I think part of what we learn is the willingness to buy in and being committed. And I think that's one of the things that John's ending with there. Let us rise up and build. I mean, just like Israel on the wall, it took every individual to do the work. And for us to do the work here that we need to do, it's going to take all of us rising up and building, getting to action. And even in verse 18, after it says, let us rise up and build, it says they strengthened their hands to do the work. Like they didn't just say it, but they physically got prepared. They made provisions, they got strengthened, they got ready to do what they committed to do. We do see a firm resolve here, which is powerful. So we'll continue on next week with lesson 22. We'll be wrapping this up. I think we've talked about that by the end of the month. And then we'll start Revelation in July, the 1st of July. So thanks for your comments and on all that. It was great, and we'll be dismissed.